All right, we're up to chapter 3 in Alistair MacIntyre's Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. And this is really a central chapter in the work. In this chapter, he discusses what he means by modernity and also by what he means by morality, morality with a capital M. And so this is a technical term as MacIntyre uses it. He's following Bernard Williams as well as perhaps Nietzsche in using morality in a rather narrow, specified sense. So when I refer to morality, unless otherwise specified, I will generally be referring to morality with a capital M. Sometimes I'll reinforce this by saying morality with a capital M. But we have that problem since I'm speaking here rather than writing a written text, so you can't necessarily see what I mean. But this is going to be the standard use of the term morality that I will be referring to here. And so we're going to see how MacIntyre explicates this idea, how he lays out what he means by morality in this sense. And this morality is the morality with a small m of modernity, of the modern age. So roughly speaking, the small m sense of morality would be something like the anthropological sense of morality, such that we could speak of, the morality of the ancient pagan Greeks, or the morality of the medieval Vikings before their conversion to Christianity, or the morality of pre-Columbian Mexico, or the morality of Polynesia prior to encounters with Westerners, or the morality of 18th century Japan. So you can speak of moralities and all these different ways, where they refer to a way of structuring a particular social and cultural order. Why then call the morality of modernity just morality with a capital M? Shouldn't we call it the morality of modernity, or give it some other name? Call it, I don't know, democratic morality or capitalist morality or something like that. Well, as we'll see, there's an important reason for just calling this morality, and morality with a capital M, and that is that it's part of the self-understanding or the self-image of morality in this sense, that it thinks of itself as something like the culmination of all of humanity's strivings to get it right about morality. That is, it takes itself to be the correct morality, to be the progressive morality, to be the universal morality that if only human beings were educated, civilized, and clear thinking, they would all adhere to. And so, of course, this conception of morality has been opposed ever since we had anthropology as a discipline in the modern sense, for the obvious reason that it seems to be, of course, obnoxiously ethnocentric. But at the same time, it is shown itself to be remarkably persistent. And all you have to do is think about, for example, questions like, for example, the way in which the United States will withhold aid from countries and regimes around the world that legalize various anti-gay policies that, for example, have laws against homosexual intercourse, that punish people for having gay relationships. Most people in the West would regard that as just wrong. And it wouldn't help to appeal to the idea that, well, these people have a different morality with a small m from our morality. That gives you a sense of the way in which morality with a capital M is still very prevalent and still has a kind of normative hold. That is to say, it has the sense of obligation for a lot of people who are brought up within modern cultures. And so we'll come back to that idea. Okay, so section 1, morality, the morality of modernity. So he starts here talking about the error of the expressivists, again, from the neo-Aristotelian point of view. Expressivism was an error not in saying that judgments must be expressive of desires and passions. The neo-Aristotelian doesn't necessarily oppose that idea just stated generically like that. Yes, of course, our moral judgments in some sense express our desires, they express our passions. But rather, the problem with expressivism is the way in which they draw the line between facts and values. So, for an expressivist, judgments about human flourishing, judgments about the human good, are excluded from being true or false empirical judgments. They're just not the kind of thing that can have a truth value. The older lingo of the emotivists would have said that they are non-cognitive judgments. That is to say, a judgment of the form, having a social life is good for a human being, from an expressivist perspective, just expresses an attitude or expresses acceptance of a norm based upon some pre-rational feeling. It does not and it cannot express anything like a truth about human nature or truth about some objective feature of the world. It just reflects an expression of an attitude. And so that's the objection that the Neo-Aristotelian is going to have, the way that they draw the line between facts, which are usually taken to be restricted to what we think of as the empirical sciences, natural sciences, and the domain of the normative or the evaluative, which is a separate domain and that doesn't have a truth value attached to it. It's just an expression of an attitude. So this is the error. But for MacIntyre, the Neo-Aristotelian can't rest content merely with observing this error. They have to also explain why expressivists make this error. It's not enough for an adequate philosophical critique of a theory that's at the level of depth of expressivism merely to claim or argue that they're in error, that one also needs to be able to explain how the error arose to really make the critique convincing. And MacIntyre's answer is what leads us to morality with a capital M. And this is the view that the expressivists took morality to be justified for all times and places. They took morality with a capital M to be justified for all times and places. That is, that they took morality with a capital M to just be what morality is. And so they offered a critique of that conception of morality, is essentially what MacIntyre is going to go on to say. And that's how they came to have their erroneous view about what the nature of moral discourse is that their object that they were trying to analyze was morality with a capital M. And what they say about morality with a capital M, MacIntyre is going to say there's a lot of truth to that. But it doesn't hold of any system of morality or any conception of morality at all times and places. Okay, so it's definitely past time, we might say, to be more precise about what exactly is meant by morality with a capital M. And so here are the 6 features that MacIntyre mentions. You can see that all right. The 6 features. The 6 characteristics of morality with a capital M. So these are the distinguishing characteristics. First, it's a secular doctrine. It's understood to provide standards of evaluation that are valid for believers as well as for unbelievers. It's not rooted in any religion. In fact, it is a standard that judges religion. So from the perspective of morality, one could judge a particular religion and say, you know what, that religion is an immoral religion. It stands, so to speak, above religion. That's one of the features. Second, morality is understood to be universally binding on all rational agents, irrespective of their culture. So your culture says female circumcision is a great thing. Sorry, it's immoral. You're wrong. It doesn't matter that your culture says otherwise because what you're doing is immoral with a capital M. That's the attitude of morality. Okay? Universally binding. So the Aztecs said that it was a good thing to have human sacrifices. Sorry, it's not a good thing. It's immoral from an absolute kind of universal perspective. But again, this is not the perspective of some, supposed absolute conception of God, because it's a purely secular conception. Third, there's an egoism-altruism opposition that's involved. That is, it's assumed normally that to act morally is to act altruistically, and therefore to act against one's own personal interests. So there's always going to be a kind of opposition between egoism, or acting selfishly, acting for yourself, and altruism, where altruism is understood to be what morality often requires of us. So we have to sacrifice our own happiness for the sake of the greater happiness. That would be a standard conception of morality. Notice, though, that this isn't necessarily the case. One can imagine a moral system in which to act for one's own self-interest and to act morally would be the same thing. So that's the point he's contrasting here. Fourth, deals with morality's conception of the moral agent. It has an abstract, one-size-fits-all description of the moral agent. So in making moral injunctions, morality doesn't take into consideration occupational or social roles. If someone said to you, hey, professor, you sound like you're saying something that's kind of racist there. You wouldn't accept it if I said to you, well, yeah, but I realize this is racist for you, but for me, since I'm a professor, it's not racist, right? You would laugh in my face if I said something like that. You can't appeal to the fact that, well, I have this particular occupation, so therefore, I'm exempt from this particular injunction, right? If it is a moral injunction that one shouldn't be racist, then it binds all moral agents, irrespective of their occupational roles, irrespective of their social roles. It's not okay for the president to be racist, and for the average person not to. It's not okay, and so forth. So it's this abstract one-size-fits-all. And there's more to this. All agents are the same in that it conceives of them having the same basic motivations as well. So it's assumed within morality that all agents aim at their happiness by aiming to satisfy their desires, as we saw in John Stuart Mill. That all are capable of acquiring the same understanding of morality, at least the key terms of morality. So it's not as if there are special moral experts. It's understood that all agents are capable of understanding morality, at least the basic terms of it. Also, all are capable of acting as free and self-controlled agents, that is, autonomous agents. That is, that is expected to apply morality to themselves. So it's not an excuse to say, well, why did you steal that candy bar from the store, for you to say, well, I thought I was going to get away with it. There is no external sanction, as Mill would say. No, it's supposed to be an internal sanction, and that's something that's binding on everyone, supposedly. And also, finally, all agents are deserving respect, but because of their autonomy. Because they are understood to be able to govern themselves according to the rules of morality, we should treat them not as children, but as reasonable adults, afforded a certain degree of respect. So that's part of the conception of the morality has of the agent. But all agents are similar in these respects. Fifth, I've already kind of touched on this, but the sense of superiority over all other moralities. Morality, with a capital M, is assumed to be superior, that is more rational, more progressive, more civilized than all other moralities. That it's the acme of moral progress. And this cuts across liberal or conservative adherence to morality. So by progressive, I don't mean to limit this just to people who are left-leaning. But we see this sort of idea often, this idea of, whenever you see the idea of moral progress, which could take the form of saying, for example, well, in the past, we had the death penalty, and now we think, for human beings, for all kinds of crimes, but now we think that even there shouldn't be the death penalty for even non-human animals. That we shouldn't kill any sentient being. And that's understood to be getting closer to the truth. And so now we're more civilized, we're more progressive, we have a better morality than they had in the past when they had these awful practices like the death penalty. Or the same thing could be from a conservative perspective. You could say that, now from our perspective, let's say, we understand that, the rights of the individual are sacrosanct, and therefore the government has no business in touching any of your property. You should be able to do whatever you want. And this is superior to these other, older perspectives that tried to hamstrung individuals by, collective agreements that they didn't agree to themselves. That kind of idea. So it cuts across whether you're talking about a liberal adherent or a conservative adherent to morality, that there's this sense of superiority, that we finally in the modern age have arrived at the true morality. Or if not the true, at least we're farther advanced towards discovering it. Just like science. Just like science. Just like science is understood to be advanced over what it was in previous centuries, so too is morality. So there's that as the fifth aspect of morality with a capital M. And then finally, this is something MacIntyre makes a lot of in this chapter, irresolvable dilemmas between utility and rights. Morality includes both a commitment to certain inviolable rights, no killing of the innocent, no torture, things like that. So just certain absolute rules, exceptionalist moral rules that under no circumstances are you allowed to kill the innocent, under no circumstances are you allowed to torture, and so forth. And the utilitarian standard, on the other hand, that of course says you should maximize well-being. And we've already explored how these are in tension with one another. They often conflict. So classic examples are the grist for the mill of many a moral philosophy course. For example, the problem of dirty hands, as it's called. You have only 15 minutes to stop a terrorist nuclear bomb from going off, and what you've got in your custody, a terrorist who knows where it is. And so, should you torture this person? Well, on the one hand, morality tells you should never torture people. On the other hand, utilitarianism says, well, what's worse, just, causing this one person suffering or letting the whole city blow up with a nuclear bomb? And so you have that kind of tension, or the famous trolley problem. I won't talk about that here. You can just Google that if you don't already know what it is. These are the stuff of everyday life, though, as well as of famous philosophical thought experiments. So MacIntyre mentioned some ways in which these sorts of problems, familiar moral problems, are not just, contrived thought experiments, but also issues that people deal with. For example, he talks on the bottom of 116 of much less melodramatic dilemmas of the same type recur in everyday life, as in we decide to violate the principle forbidding lying because of the pain to numbers of people that will be caused by telling the truth in this particular case. Or we commit an injustice to a small group who are unlikely to complain in order to benefit a large and vociferous group who will make an intolerable nuisance of themselves if they do not get what they want. Or we justify some infringement of the property rights of homeowners in the name of economic development. These sorts of conflicts between this conception of inviolable rights on the one hand and consequentialist thinking on the other hand that says you should maximize the good, it leads to progressive disagreement at the level of theory. So there's unending arguments between deontologists, so-called, and utilitarians or consequentialists at the level of philosophical theory, but also inconsistent oscillation and hypocritical rhetoric at the level of practice, where you have politicians will speak about, for example, the inalienable rights of every American and this sort of thing, and meanwhile acting in such a way that shows that they don't respect that. Or, quite often, in the case of foreign policy, utilitarian considerations override the rhetoric of respect for human rights. Now, MacIntyre notes three immediate and apparent contrasts between this and the Aristotelian moral stance. So we've got another set of contrasts here. We had, of course, expressivism and neo-Aristotelianism. Expressivism, though, is what's called a meta-ethical theory. That is, it's an explanation of the nature of moral discourse, the meaning of moral terms, the ontological status of ethical entities like goodness and badness and so forth, rightness and wrongness. Whereas morality is understood as being kind of a catch-all that describes more of the normative sphere of ethics, the character of the injunctions that morality imposes upon modern agents and the way in which those modern agents are understood from within that moral stance. And so on both levels, both against the expressivist and against morality with a capital M, MacIntyre is going to array the Aristotelian moral stance as an alternative. And so in this case, he's comparing Aristotelianism with morality. And he says that first, Aristotelianism bases ethical precepts on the foundation that there are goods qua human being. Goods qua human being. That is, goods insofar as one is a human being, and just merely insofar as one is a human being, that one can achieve or fail to achieve. But morality is not committed to even the existence of such goods. Second, Aristotelianism holds that individual goods can only be achieved in concert with common goods, and these only in and through the particularities of one's relationships and circumstances. In morality, by contrast, requirements are abstract enough that they can apply to individuals in their relationships to any and all other individuals, regardless of relationships and circumstances. And MacIntyre sees this as largely eliminating the need for prudence, or phronesis in the traditional Aristotelian sense, or prudence in the Thomistic and scholastic sense, that have to deal with being able to know, questions of appropriateness with respect to all these different relationships that one might find oneself in and all the different roles that one might find oneself in. In morality, all of that is kind of leveled out. And the relationships are just conceived abstractly in terms of individuals relating to other individuals. And so this eliminates the need for prudence as classically conceived. Third, morality draws a sharp dividing line between the moral, on the one hand, and other seemingly related categories, such as the political, the legal, the aesthetic, and the economic. And Aristotelianism will recognize none of these lines. That is, for the Aristotelian, each of these types of activity can only be understood in terms of the other. The question is always how are these domains going to contribute to or frustrate the achievement of the human good? And so the moral domain and the political domain are not clearly separable, nor is the legal domain. And of course, we've seen in Aristotle the way in which the aesthetic domain is not clearly separable from the ethical domain, with the value of the fine or the kolon. And the economic domain as well also comes in here, as we saw in the previous video. So economics, law, sociology, and so forth need to be understood within a political cum ethical framework. Whereas with morality is separated off and understood to be just a kind of separate domain from these other things, an autonomous domain. For MacIntyre, you can't simply take the precepts of morality in isolation and analyze their form and content as if they didn't have any meaning that derives from their political, economic, legal context. The precepts of morality get their significance from the role they play in the everyday and academic lives of the people who are informed by them. One crucial question that arises about the precepts of morality in the context of the rest of life is, where do these precepts derive their peculiar authority from? For those for whom they have authority, which is, I think MacIntyre thinks, the normal, modern moral agent. Where do they get this authority? Laws get their authority from the authority and coercive power of the state. Everyone knows that. Economists get their authority from their theoretical arguments and their empirical data. But where does morality get its authority from? Now, the theoretical apologists for morality share the view, despite their wide differences, but they share the view that morality must be grounded in some universal standard that is independent of any particular person's attitudes or feelings. Some universal standard that's independent of any particular person's attitudes or feelings. But these theoreticians of morality disagree about what this standard is. And hence, they generally tend to see expressivism as a threat to their convictions. And we'll see why a little bit later on. But expressivism, of course, is going to challenge the idea that there's some impersonal standard on which morality is grounded. So that much is obvious already. The ongoing disagreements and conflicts among the theorists of morality gives the impression of dogmatic assertion and counter-assertion, playing into the hands of the expressivists. That is, the various camps, the deontologists and the consequentialists, typically in ethical theory, appear to be doing just what the expressivist says they're doing. They're expressing their pre-rational commitments and attitudes. So you can look at Mill's utilitarianism as sort of one entry in this exchange of dogmatic assertion and counter-assertion. Mill is giving expression there to the voices of those on the other side. So you get a sense of what kind of disagreement existed and still exists that MacIntyre is thinking of here. And what he's saying is that the expressivist looks at this and says, well, these people are just expressing their pre-rational attitudes. That's why they're disagreeing. If there was really any truth to the matter, ethical theory would be like science. You'd arrive at agreement about some of these things, but they don't. Now, because morality, capital M, is an idiosyncratic form of morality with a small m, that is, an idiosyncratic form of morality in the anthropological sense, it's a puzzle for MacIntyre how it came to be in its position of cultural hegemony. This is a question. He raises this question in the middle of the last paragraph of page 119. How could this particular set of judgments and ideals be presented as be accepted as having authority in virtue of a standard independent of the attitudes, feelings, and concerns of those who acknowledge that authority, without ever having been able to give a rationally justifiable account of what that standard is? So everyone is accepting this as having this overriding standard of authority binding on us, these injunctions like to not kill innocents, to not torture, but at the same time to maximize welfare and so on, applying to all agents, moral agents equally, impersonally, and universally, having an overriding authority such that if your desire tells you to torture, then you should follow what morality says and not your desire, and so forth. How did that come to be hegemonic when no one has yet been able to give an account of where the authority of morality comes from? That's the question he's asking here. So to see how morality came to occupy its position of cultural hegemony, he thinks, we need to examine wider aspects of its culture, of the culture in which it flourishes. And this is the culture of what he calls enlightened modernity, obviously alluding to the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment in Western Europe. So that's the next thing we need to look at. Where did morality come from? In what culture did it arise? And what insight does that give us into how it came to have cultural hegemony? But before we get to that, I want to ask our first discussion question. First discussion question. Do you recognize your own pre-reflective conception of morality in MacIntyre's description of morality with a capital M? Prior to this, had it ever occurred to you that morality might be anything other than morality with a capital M? Would you now, or have you ever been inclined to say that morality, small m, just is morality with a capital M? If so, why do or did you think this? If not, can you think of any reasons why other people would think that this is what morality is? How would you assess these reasons? So first discussion question. Do you recognize your own pre-reflective conception of morality in MacIntyre's description of morality with a capital M? That is, do you recognize your own pre-reflective conception of morality in these 6 points? Prior to this, had it ever occurred to you that morality might be anything other than morality with a capital M? Would you now, or have you ever been inclined to say that morality with a small m just is morality with a capital M? If so, why do or did you think this? If not, can you think of any reasons why other people would think that this is what morality is? How would you assess these reasons? Section 2, the modernity in which morality is at home. MacIntyre begins this section with the observation that, while needs may be constant, desires are very culturally variable. Desires are closely related to affections, habits, and beliefs, and all these issue in variable ways of life. Hence, we can learn a lot about modern society and culture from what MacIntyre describes as, quote, peculiarly modern forms of opportunity and hope, insecurity and poverty, regret and lament and ambition, unquote, on page 120. So we can learn a lot about modern society and culture from the modern forms of opportunity, hope, insecurity, poverty, regret, lament, ambition. Long-term economic growth and technological innovation has made possible within modernity new opportunities for work, new occupations, and social mobility. This is kind of a truism. A lot of the things he says in this section are going to be sort of truisms. It's just he's kind of reminding us of the distinctive conditions of modernity rather, that are very familiar to, of course, people who live within the modern world, but that sometimes they're so familiar that we fail to appreciate their distinctiveness and how unique they are in terms of the way in which we live compared to the way in which humans in a pre-modern condition live or have lived. So the first is that it's made possible new opportunities for work, new occupations, and social mobility. MacIntyre describes three types of what he calls aspiring agents, recognizable types of modern people at three class levels. Top of 121. First, 19th and 20th century workers in more or less regular employment in mills and factories who as workers realistically aspire to better the lot of themselves and their families while remaining working class. Secondly, those individuals of the same period who, whatever their social origin, were able to acquire the skills and had the imagination and the luck needed to make their way upwards through the class system toward whatever was accounted locally as social and economic success. And finally, third, those contemporaries of unrestrained financial ambition with the initial resources to serve that ambition, for whom nothing was and is ever enough. Then MacIntyre asks, top of 122, what intellectual, moral, and social resources do such agents have if in moments of reflection they ask how it would be best for them to order their desires and so their lives? For MacIntyre, modern agents lack badly needed resources for ordering their desires and their lives, because of the modes of thought characteristic of people in their type of situation, and also because of the nature of those situations themselves. In all three cases, at all three of these class levels, their situations are shaped by the flow of money, which regulates the relationship between the wages and the salaries people earn and the prices of the goods and services for which they pay. People, especially of course in the lower classes, people are encouraged to moderate their desires according to the question, what can I afford? They're driven to evaluate things according to the standard of how the market values things, which in turn is driven by the market's response to demand. Where does demand come from? From people at any given time who happen to have the money. That's where demand comes from. In a modern economy, producers are required also to be consumers in order to keep the market afloat. They need to be able to distinguish what is or what could be of genuine value for the flourishing of their lives versus what the market tries to get them to value. However, MacIntyre notes that modern societies do not make it easy for working and middle-class people to engage in the kind of shared deliberation and decision-making that's necessary for making these distinctions. Resistance by the lower classes to what's been presented as necessary for economic growth or for the market has been recurrent, but it's usually reactive against perceived injustice, rather than based upon an alternative conception of the direction that society and the economy should take. MacIntyre diagnoses the problem as follows, quote, the characteristic habits of thought of modernity are such that they make it extremely difficult to think about modernity except in its own terms, unquote. Page 123. For MacIntyre, modernity is built on distinctive institutions, and these institutions inculcate distinctively modern habits of thought, as he puts it. These habits of thought, in turn, make it very difficult to think about modernity in a way that makes possible a radical critique of modernity. Thus, those modern institutions and the modern habits of thought that they encourage need to be analyzed in order to see how they lead to what MacIntyre calls, quote, the particular formations and deformations of desires that emerge in the context of modernity, unquote. The particular formations of desires and deformations of desires that emerge in this specific socio-cultural context. Section 3, State and Market. The ethics of the state, one word, hyphenated, the ethics of the state, and the ethics of the market. The politics of the modern world is characterized by the modern nation state, which monopolizes legal authority and the use of force, and has lawmaking powers that allow that authority to be extended indefinitely. Expansion of their powers and domains leads modern nation states to becoming increasingly complex. And this complexity of the state apparatus requires the institution of hierarchical bureaucracies with their impersonal codes of conduct. The point of a code, contrary to what many a University of New Mexico student or students at similar institutions may feel, is not to frustrate those who are subject to them, but it's to ensure impartial and equal treatment. So the ethics of the state requires impersonality from the bureaucrats. It requires them to follow something like the injunctions that you should treat these people always the same in these same ways, without making exceptions, without showing any favoritism, and so forth. And in that sense, it's like a deontological rule. There's a policy, everyone is subject to the policy, there's no exceptions. We don't do this to be mean, but we do this to be egalitarian, to treat everybody equally and fairly. That's the idea. So that's what the ethics of the state requires of the bureaucrats. But from their masters, their political masters, the rulers of the state, it requires something different. It requires that they should promote the public goods of the state as they understand them. In other words, it requires a kind of consequentialist thinking. We want to maximize the welfare of the state as this is understood by them, whether this is, of course, something like the gross domestic product, whether it's security, whether it's happiness, whatever it may be. And the public goods of the state are typically things that benefit individuals and individual projects, but that individuals couldn't achieve by themselves. So things like public works, roads, public education, law and order, stable currency, and national security. MacIntyre observes, quote, "To achieve these goods, they, the rulers, must be prepared to use whatever means are necessary, while making it appear that they only use such means as are generally thought morally acceptable," unquote. If we combine the impartial and impersonal ethic of equality that's characteristic of state bureaucrats, and the utilitarian and often Machiavellian ethic of the rulers, the ethics of the state may appear to be incoherent. But that typically is something that's worked out in practice. It's a problem more for theoreticians most of the time than it is practically speaking, because of course politicians are often quite happy to be hypocritical. So that's one way to solve the problem of an incoherence in your ethic, is to be hypocritical. Given the great authority and the powers of the modern state, the question how to ensure its legitimacy became a central question of modern political theory. Why should I give the state all this power, all this authority? By what right does the state, arrogate to itself, monopolize all of the use of force, for example? And so legitimacy became a central issue of political theory, and two main types of justification of the authority of the state were given. First was that the ruled agreed to respect the laws of the state in exchange for the benefits conferred by the state. But the problem with this has always been that there are the great many for whom the benefits of the state are too meager. So it's not really much of a justification for them, for those who are living below the poverty line, for example. Second, the government, this second type of justification that's been given, is that the government is legitimate insofar as it expresses the desires of the governed. Now this is more credible, MacIntyre thinks, but only insofar as elections are an effective vehicle for implementing the policies that the governed want. Are elections an effective vehicle for implementing the policies that the governed want, such that government is expressive of the desires of the governed? And MacIntyre's answer is no. Because the set of alternatives that the average citizen is allowed to vote on is set not by the average citizen, but by special interests who have the financial power to do so. The result is that liberal democratic societies are ostensibly committed to political equality, but in fact, gross financial and educational inequalities issue in gross political inequalities. Those with money and education belong to the ruling elite. Those without money and education are excluded from the decision-making process. So the distribution of political power is a direct effect of the distribution of money and financial power. And the distribution of financial power, in turn, is a direct effect of the markets. Ergo, the state rests on the market. Power in the market resides in the possessors of capital, who decide where investments will be made and where they will not be made. Where investment occurs determines the job market and the opportunities for work. And the market, of course, values some mental qualities and human skills over others, generally relative to their usefulness in making money. Acquisitiveness is not only a highly valued and rewarded character trait, it's also a duty that managers have to their investors. So there's an ethics of the market parallel to the ethics of the state that derives from these characteristics of the market. And this ethics of the market is founded on the model of the impersonal contractual relationship, which must be observed apart from legal enforcement for the sake of efficiency. That is, the market relies on people generally adhering to their contracts without having to be taken to court, because lawsuits are expensive and an inefficient way to do business. So if people didn't generally follow this ethic of the market and generally follow the requirements of their stipulations of their contract without having to have the police come and force them to, the market wouldn't work. It would be too inefficient. So that's one part of it. The impersonal contractual relationship, which is, of course, is foundational to the functioning of the market. That's one part of the ethics of the market, these impersonal contractual relationships, which correspond something like the bureaucratic impersonality, right? Or the deontological injunctions of morality. And then there's also a consequentialist side, just as there is with the ethics of the state, where the rulers have to try to maximize the general welfare of the society as they understand it. So too, of course, in the market, there's a maximizing component, which is, of course, the imperative to maximize profits. The ethics of the contractual relationship requires the parties to adhere to the contract regardless of the consequences. Someone can't come along and say, I think it'd be better if we did it this way. If you're contractually obligated to do it another way, you have to do what the contract says, right? So the ethics of the contractual relationships require the parties to adhere to the contract regardless of the consequences, whether it's the best way or not. I mean, what's in the contract is what you have to do. So that's one aspect. And then in tension with this is the ethos of the capitalist managers, which demands maximization of returns for the shareholders. Note that this is the same tension as in the case of the ethics of the state, with the tension between the bureaucratic ethos on the one hand and the ruler's duty to maximize welfare on the other hand. In sum, just as the state could not function without the ethics of the state, one word, ethics of the state, hyphenated, right? The market cannot function without the ethics of the market. Again, one word, the ethics of the market. And both of these, the ethics of the state and the ethics of the market, are internally in tension. Yet, in everyday situations, no question of consistency commonly arises. So MacIntyre calls these ethics, but it's important to note, and he remarks early on, that he says both are in important ways parodies of ethics. They're ethics in scare quotes. In the foregoing analysis, MacIntyre has treated the state and the market as if they were two separate things. But in fact, in the contemporary world, this is just an abstraction. There's really only one complex entity, which you might call the state and market. The state and market, one word, hyphenated. On page 128, he describes the evolution of this entity, the formation of this entity historically. Yet in the second half of the 20th century, in every major capitalist country, the complex relationships between state and market become so close that individuals in many of their transactions confront something that is not quite either but both at once. So here are examples of state and market. Mortgages from banks guaranteed by agencies of the state. Wages paid by firms dependent upon government contracts. Taxes paid to provide subsidies for firms that will provide employment. Schools and universities whose curricula are designed to produce a useful and amenable labor force and whose research may be supported only because its outcomes are thought to benefit economic growth. And these are only some of the simpler examples. So we see examples of these things, of course, this age of relief from the pandemic, government stipend checks and these sorts of things, government subsidies of businesses so they can hire people back, this sort of thing. We're very familiar with this. We're very familiar with the fact that we live in a world constrained by the ethics of the state and market, in which our occupational and social roles very much fall under the dominion of this ethic because they fall under the dominion of this entity, this state and market. As individuals, however, we'll also face practical questions that cannot be answered by this ethic, the ethic of the state and market. In particular, we find ourselves subject to precepts to maximize some good and also to follow rules that prohibit some action with regard to the consequences. What's the relationship between these precepts? We've been educated to believe that this is the type of problem to be dealt with under the heading of morality, with a capital M. We're educated to believe that the precepts of morality are distinct from and prior to the precepts of political and economic life. But the true function of morality, according to MacIntyre, is to impose constraints on our choice of goals and the means that we may adopt to pursue those goals. It does this by imposing limits on the satisfaction of our desires and the pursuit of our interests. In other words, morality with a capital M, teaches us to constrain and order our desires in a way that's consonant with the functioning of the ethics of the state and market. How is this so? Well, here's what MacIntyre takes up in the next sections. Section 4, desires, ends, and the multiplication of desires. MacIntyre next asks, what is it about modern desires that allows them to be expressed, contained, and ordered according to the needs and the dictates of the functioning of the state and market? As a preliminary to answering this question, MacIntyre surveys the characteristic sources of modern desire, the sources of modern desire, what he calls the, quote, multifarious and heterogeneous sources of desire in modernity and the consequent multifarious and heterogeneous desires. Page 132. He considers four main sources of modern desires: needs, activities, responsibilities, and enjoyments. So, desires are shaped by needs. First and primarily by biological needs, but also by needs for enjoying some aspects of one's life, finding meaning in one's activities, and for the things that enable one to be a fully participating member of one's society. Needs that are easily satisfied typically in modernity do not rise to the level of conscious desire. A desire like the desire not to be out of work or the desire for companionship may range from barely registering if it's satisfied to being all-consuming in one's consciousness if it's not met. If basic needs are not met, desires for meeting those needs generally become the totality of desire at the time. But if they are met, generally such needs are not felt as a source of desire. Instead, in modernity, such desires are often felt as a fear or anxiety about unemployment and the consequences thereof, when basic needs wouldn't be met. Then MacIntyre turns to activities as sources of desire. He observes that the kind of work activity that allows individuals to take responsibility and set ends for themselves, as opposed to being managed from the top down, are the kinds of activities in which desires are educated and transformed, as he says. And he gives these examples of the Japanese auto plants under the influence of W. Edwards Deming's theories, the BBC. I won't recount those here, but this contrast between the kind of work that is typically more often available to educated elites, more creative, more self-driven work, versus the work that is offered to working class people, which tends to be more monotonous and controlled by the profit imperative above all else, rather than by human needs. So that's with regard to desire in respect to activities. In the case of responsibility for educating children, desires are shaped by our sense of the possibilities for the future, especially whether and how the future may be structured differently from now. And this creates a role for what he calls imaginative visions of alternative ways of life. Imaginative visions of alternative ways of life. So it's characteristic of modernity that it generates a series of such visions. For example, at different stages in the history of modernity, democratic, feminist, communist, fascist, black nationalist, hippie, anarchist, Islamist, anti-fascist, anti-racist, sustainable, green, vegan, etc. Visions of the way in which, one hopes one's children would be. So that's another source of desires that we find in modernity. And then finally, enjoyments are multiplied exponentially in modernity. And this becomes the source of two types of desires. Desires to excel in one or more of the areas made possible by modernity. For example, starting a rock band, being a competitive video game player. And desires to enjoy the products of those who do excel. I need to try out the newest edition of Halo or whatever. So this is just kind of a survey. He's kind of collecting data about the kinds of desires that are characteristic of modernity, that arise in modernity under these conditions. Section 5, the structuring of desires by norms. MacIntyre argues that the norms that structure the desires of the modern moral agent are basically threefold. And we've already mentioned all three of these sources of norms. There's the ethics of the state, the ethics of the market, and morality with a capital M. The multiplication of desire is a fact of the modern condition. The multiplication of desires, however, gives rise to the need to make choices among one's desires and to ask a certain sort of questions. And he lists these in this first paragraph, page 133. To which desire should I give priority? Which desire should I treat as realistic and which as vain wishes? How should I respond to conflicts of desire? I happen to want this and this and this, but my pursuit of any one of these will prevent me from achieving the others. And whichever I pursue, I may be haunted by damaging regret for my loss of the others. So how should I choose? And how am I to become reflective in my choice-making? Closely related questions are posed when the possibility of conflicts with others arises, because if I act so as to satisfy my desire, I will interfere with or frustrate your attempt to satisfy your desire. So how should I think about the relationship between myself and others so that in my choices I take due account of the desires of others as well as my own? Now, the modern agent cannot find answers to such questions merely by imitating their parents or teachers and sliding into some predetermined social role, which is typically the way that these sorts of things are answered in pre-modern times, or the corresponding questions that would arise in pre-modern times if they arise. So why is that? Why is it that you can't just answer these questions about how to order your desires by imitating your parents, teachers, sliding into a predetermined role? Well, first, it has always and everywhere been the case that it's up to the individual to decide how much resistance to exert against one's roles. A role always is going to have a tendency to restrict and restrain one's desires, but do I lean into that role and try to be just like the best butler ever? Or do I subvert the traditional understanding of the role? And, as it were, try to twist and extend and push the boundaries of what my role allows me to do. That's always been a question with regard to roles. And so that question cannot be answered, of course, by appealing to the role itself. How should I occupy the role can't be answered by appealing to the idea that, just follow the role. So that's the first problem. And then secondly, it's understood in modernity that the roles that one occupies should express one's own choices, which in turn express one's desires. Standards determining choices only have authority insofar as the acknowledgement of that authority is compatible with the affirmation of the autonomy of the agent. So, for example, a Muslim woman wearing a hijab. Is that a feminist statement or not? The answer to that question is going to depend within modernity on the conception or description of that as that act of wearing a Muslim woman wearing a hijab as either an affirmation of her autonomy because she's chosen to do this and she's chosen to occupy that role within that particular socio-religious structure, or not. And if she hasn't, if it's been imposed on her, it's understood as not being a feminist statement, as being anti-feminist. But if she chooses it, right, then it's feminist. So that's what we mean by saying that the standards are assumed to have authority within modern morality only insofar as the acknowledgement of that authority is compatible with the affirmation of the autonomy of the agent. The problem faced by the modern moral agent is a lack of agreement over how one should rank order the objects of desire. Modern society is characterized by rival conceptions of the good life for human beings, and the state is supposed to stay neutral between these rival conceptions, only serving as a referee to prevent one group's pursuit of their desires from harming another group in the pursuit of their desires. So if a Muslim woman, wants to wear a hijab in a modern liberal democratic state, there's pressure at least to let her wear the hijab if that's what she chooses to do. This is why this becomes controversial in France, for example, when they attempt to pass laws to ban this sort of thing. Whether this is this really consonant with the ideals of modern liberalism to do this? So it seems then that the ethics of the state and market are not going to be a lot of help in helping us to order our desires, to rank them, to decide between them. But with regard to the market, modern society, and even with regard to the state system, modern society does have something that may seem to help, a social conception of success. Success is achieved through competition in the educational, economic, or political sphere. To compete successfully is to ensure that one's preferences are satisfied and that your preferences are satisfied rather than your competitor. The purpose of the law is understood to be to lay down the ground rules for the competition and to prohibit the use of certain means, such as force or fraud. Modern competition is structured by the norms of the ethics of the state and the ethics of the market and the enactments of the law. Now, these norms of success shape many of our desires, but they're insufficient because the law leaves open too many areas for aggressively and competitively pursuing the satisfaction of our desires. So it underdetermines which desires we should pursue. And where the law is effective at civilizing desire, it can only do so because of an internalized moral consensus. So it's not enough to say just, pick a job, obey the law, and that's what you should do. There's still too much wiggle room in there for different ways of doing that. And the law itself depends upon an internalized moral consensus, which is the consensus on which the social order depends. And that is morality with a capital M. The political, social, economic order depends upon morality with a capital M, just as much as it does on the ethics of the state and the ethics of the market. Section 6. How and why morality functions as it does. So we've gone through the ethics of the state, the ethics of the market, the law. Now we're up to morality, and we still haven't gotten an answer to this question. How can we, as modern agents, learn to rank order our desires? Does morality help us at all with this? How does morality function? Why does it function as it does? We've already said it functions to, as it were, keep the gears greased of the state and market system. It works as a means of limiting and partially civilizing the desires of modern moral agents. But what enables it to do this? A necessary condition of this is that morality is taken by those who believe in it to have a definite overriding authority. The nature of this authority is such that the adherents to morality take the failure to live up to it to be a failure as a human being. Yet, if you ask the typical ordinary person who adheres to morality what its authority consists of and where it comes from, they couldn't tell you. Right? So, I mean, just take the racism example or homophobia. It's standard. If someone, calls you a racist or calls you a homophobe, you could infer that they think you're a bad human being, and in that sense, a failure as a human being. You failed as a human being, at least in that respect, right? And that comes from morality with a capital M. But if you ask that same person who says, well, you're racist, you're homophobic, where do you get the authority to make these judgments? Where does it come from? And typically, they couldn't tell you. And if they do try to tell you, maybe someone has a smattering of philosophy or they thought about this and they've come up with their own idea. Typically, you'll wind up in interminable debates between different people of what the foundation of these judgments is. This is ordinary people we're talking about now. And of course, it's even worse in the case of their counterparts in academic philosophy. The main difference is that ordinary people are generally content to remain inconsistent between consequentialists and being right-affirming deniers of consequentialism at other times, whereas theorists feel bound to revise morality theoretically in order to make it consistent. So that's the main difference. But as far as having a solid ground for compelling agreement on the question of the authority of morality, ordinary people and theorists are pretty much in the same boat. They're convinced that the impersonal standard of morality should have the authority to limit and constrain the desires of individuals, and yet they're unable to provide any conclusive reason for adopting this standpoint, or at least any reason proportionate to its claims. Morality is able to function with authority in modernity only because it is taken to be an entirely secular institution. It's marked by the kind of absolute rejection of all religious claims that's characteristic of certain strains of the Enlightenment. It was insistent on the need to judge the misdeeds of kings and priests from an independent secular standpoint. And that is where morality really kind of came into its own in the Enlightenment, this idea that there's a moral standard that's universal, that's not rooted theologically, and that can judge the established church and the established political order, which, of course, in the pre-modern period of Europe was bound up with religious authorization and legitimation. So morality, therefore, was conceived as having to be compelling to all reasonable persons, regardless of their theological beliefs. Thus, its authority could not rest on theological grounds. However, no alternative ground for morality's authority has ever been agreed to. But that doesn't stop morality from becoming the sole official morality of modern society and culture. Section 7, morality put in question by expressivism, the limits of an expressivist critique. Modern moral agents who are committed to morality will often confront dilemmas in which their commitment to morality with its impersonal injunctions runs into conflicts with their personal desires. And so on page 139, MacIntyre gives this rather extended sort of hypothetical. Basically, the idea is, imagine like a good friend of yours to whom you really owe a lot, is applying for a job. I think this works if you think of it as like a national security job. And, some investigator comes for a background check and they ask you questions. And they ask you, like a question about whether, let's say, your friend gambles. I'm adding to it. And that if you tell the truth, which is, that your friend gambles because, you and your friend go to the casino twice a week and that he's kind of borderline got a gambling addiction, right? And so the question is, do you answer truthfully? And as a person who adheres to morality, and you think that it's really important to be moral according to these conceptions of what is to be moral, you're inclined to think, well, morality has this injunction against lying. I shouldn't lie. Certainly not for this kind of reason, so that a person can get a job on false pretenses. But on the other hand, this is my friend. I really don't want to screw my friend out of this job. I know how much he wants this job and so forth. And, I know that if he gets this job, he's going to get help for his gambling addiction. It's not really going to be an issue. And so do I tell the truth or right? That's the example. And initially in such a conflict, a person committed to morality will understand themselves as tempted to do wrong by their desires and inclinations. My desire for my friend's benefit is tempting me to do what I know in my heart is wrong, to do the wrong thing. This is what morality, the way morality tells you should think, because it takes itself as having this kind of overriding, universally binding authority. However, MacIntyre asks, what if you're informed by expressivism's analysis of ethical discourse? How will that affect your attitude towards the conflict in question? So recall that expressivism says that the authority of moral norms always comes from the agent's pre-rational acceptance of a norm. Pre-rational, that is, as in based on emotion. But in the hypothetical, the emotion is on the side of the desires. It's not on the side of the injunction of morality. So the agent will first ask whether and why she has any reason for her to defer to those impersonal norms. And modern moral theorists will give her various answers to this question. MacIntyre lists these in the bottom of 139. She consults other philosophically well-informed friends, and among the answers that she considers are that if she flouts the injunctions, she will be lacking respect for herself as a rational agent, and that she will be unable to universalize the maxims on which she will be acting, and that she will not be acting so as to maximize human happiness or preference satisfaction. So in other words, I'm thinking, okay, do I have reason to adhere to morality in the face of my desire to do what morality tells me not to do? What's the reason? Why do I adhere to morality in the first place? Why do I accept this as my norm? As the expressivist says, is what I'm doing. And so one might say, well, it's because, in order to respect yourself as a person who's governed by reason, you have to adhere to morality, as opposed to the person who plays favorites based upon your feelings. You want to behave like a purely rational person. Or you're asking yourself, well, what if everyone did that? I couldn't universalize this action, because if everyone did that, the whole system would break down or whatever. Or I might be worried about, if everyone did this, how would that affect the happiness of society and so forth? But regardless of whether I accept any of these reasons, or I merely directly accede to the injunction of morality without having a reason, it's all the same according to the expressivist. It's all the result of some pre-rational impulse. If I decide for some reason I've got this attachment to the idea of myself as a rational agent, I admire Mr. Spock or something like that, so I have to be purely rational. I can't behave on emotions. Well, that itself is just a way of behaving on emotions, a different kind of emotion, a pre-rational impulse, according to the expressivist. This is what the expressivist analysis tells me. So following this expressivist line of reasoning, the agent's conception of the conflict between morality and her desire changes. Previously, she thought that her desires were tempting her to do something wrong. However, now she sees the conflict merely as a conflict between two sets of emotions. My emotional attachment to this stuff and my emotional attachment to my friend. And she'll be forced to ask, how am I to choose between these conflicting sets of feelings and desires? And expressivism cannot answer that question. We can see from this hypothetical how expressivism can serve as a critique of the pretensions of morality to having the authority to override an agent's desires. MacIntyre believes that expressivism has noticed something true about moral authority. A moral injunction can have authority over us only if we can be motivated to obey it, and we can be motivated to obey it only if it can be seen as expressive of our feelings and desires and attitudes. MacIntyre accepts that any acceptable moral theory, any acceptable ethical theory, must provide an acceptable psychological account of how ethical judgments can motivate. Where he disagrees with expressivists and Hume is in thinking that they have an unacceptably narrow account of the possible sources of human motivation. True judgments about the human good can also motivate. and not merely emotions and feelings and desires for pleasure and avoidance for pain. True judgments about the human good can also motivate. So, an important consequence of the expressivist critique, according to MacIntyre, the critique of morality with a capital M, is that the hypothetical suggests that the assertive moral stances of those who adhere naively to morality are only possible because they're unaware of the true source of the authority of morality. They speak, act, and behave as if morality had independent authority, but in fact it's just grounded in their own attitudes, sentiments, and choices. Adherents to morality can't admit this, however, because to admit it would be to undercut their belief in the overriding authority of the injunctions of morality. Right? You're a racist, that's bad. I say, yeah, but you're just saying that because, you've got an emotional attachment to the idea of anti-racism. And if they're an expressivist and they acknowledge that, they'll have to say, yeah, you're right. But then on what grounds are they, chastising you for not having the same emotional attachment they do? That's like complaining because someone is an Aggies fan as opposed to a Lobos fan. So that's the upshot of the expressivist critique of morality. Undercuts this sort of overriding authority that morality with a capital M is assumed to have. But the problem of resolving the conflict between feelings and desires remains. What we still need is a standard independent of my feelings and desires by which I can rank, order, and adjudicate my desires. This is a practical need. But expressivism shows that morality is not able to provide such a standard, and nor can expressivism itself. So this leads to a second discussion question. In your view, does morality, with a capital M, have the normative authority necessary in order to provide an authoritative standard for rank ordering one's desires and settling conflicts between desires? Does morality have the overriding authority that it claims to have, such that in a conflict between an injunction of morality and a desire, the right thing to do is always to follow the injunction of morality and refuse the desire? How would you assess the cogency of the expressivist critique of the pretensions of morality to overriding authority? Where does morality get this authority from? And how might the advocate of morality respond to the expressivist critique? So once again, second discussion question. In your view, does morality with a capital M have the normative authority necessary in order to provide an authoritative standard for rank ordering one's desires and settling conflicts between desires? Does morality have the overriding authority that it claims to have, such that in a conflict between an injunction of morality and a desire, the right thing to do is always to follow the injunction of morality and refuse the desire? How would you assess the cogency of the expressivist critique of the pretensions of morality to overriding authority? Where does morality get this authority from? How might the advocate of morality respond to the expressivist critique? Okay, so next MacIntyre turns to three prominent British critics of morality to see if they have any illuminating insights that suggest what this needed standard is going to be. First two are British authors, Oscar Wilde, the Anglo-Irish author of the 19th century, and D.H. Lawrence, 20th century author, both quite philosophical. And then the philosopher Bernard Williams, who is by far the most important one for MacIntyre. And so we'll conclude this video with just a brief discussion of the first two and leave Williams for next time, because MacIntyre devotes a quite more extensive discussion to him. Of course, MacIntyre believes that the standard that we need to rank order our desires is to be found in the neo-Aristotelian idea of the human good. However, to prepare the ground for that conclusion, he wants to look at more modern options from thinkers who recognize the flaws of morality, but who do not think to return to the Aristotelian perspective. And so Wilde and D.H. Lawrence, along with someone like Nietzsche or Marx, Freud, are famous figures, cultural figures, for their critique of morality. Section 8 is morality put in question by Oscar Wilde. Wilde represents the aesthetic or aestheticist critique of morality. So can perhaps the aesthetic domain, the domain of art and beauty, provide an alternative standpoint to the impersonal standpoint of morality? Now, Wilde's critique of morality is an expressivist critique. His view is that morality is the expression of a distinctive set of unacknowledged feelings, and that those feelings are contemptible ones from Wilde's point of view. So we see a couple, one-liners here on page 142. Conscience and cowardice are really the same thing, Basil. Conscience is the trade name of the firm, that's all. That's a quote from the picture of Dorian Gray. And then, morality is simply the attitude that we adopt towards people whom we personally dislike. You can see that a lot in politics, right? I dislike you, so you're a racist, you're immoral. In Wilde's view, the artist has to adopt a standpoint outside of morality in order to be an artist. There's this line of virtue and wickedness are to him, to the artist, simply what the colors on his palette are to the painter. MacIntyre regards Wilde's own aestheticism as inconsistent and unhelpful, but he thinks that Wilde does succeed in raising two questions that we need to reckon with. First, what is the role of the arts in human life? There's a tension between liberal modernity's view that it's up to each individual to select their own rank ordering of goods, and the common modern view that someone who fails to develop an appreciation of the arts is a defective human being. This suggests that there are some goods that are independent of and prior to our preferences. It also suggests an objection to Frankfurt's view that what I care about is fundamental to our practical choices. We can ask, what should I care about? And an encounter with the great work of art can make us realize, my God, I could have spent my whole life not caring about what I should have been caring about, namely this stuff. A second question that Wilde poses: might it not be the case that artists are sometimes justified in violating moral rules for the sake of their art? He uses the example of Graham Sunderland's portrait of Churchill as an example of the greatness of the work of art sort of overriding moral qualms. The practice of the serious artist suggests that the existence of evaluative standards, let me restate that the practice of the serious artist suggests that there exist evaluative standards that do not conform to the expressivist model in the arts, that there's a sense of quality or greatness that only emerges through serious engagement with an art. Seriously learning, like taking courses in music appreciation or an instrument and really learning what the achievement of a great composer for that instrument was, that allowed judgments that express feelings and attitudes of those that are artistically educated enough to pass judgment, that kind of area. And then finally, section 9, morality put in question by D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence's attitude towards morality is expressed in the quote that MacIntyre provides from an essay entitled Art and Morality, page 147. The moral instinct of the man in the street is largely the emotional defense of an old habit. And he explains this as follows. This is MacIntyre's words now. That habit is one of seeing oneself and identifying one's feelings in stock and conventional ways, with the result that one does not see what is there to be seen and does not know what one feels. The task of the artist, of painters, poets, novelists, is to enable us to see and to feel by showing us what there is to be seen and to be felt, putting us into a new relationship to ourselves, to others, and to things. Then this is from Lawrence again. A new relationship between ourselves and the universe means a new morality. So Lawrence mistrusted the ways in which our feelings were shaped by our social environment. Society tells us that we're supposed to feel and desire in the social roles that we occupy, rather than feeling and desiring in a way that's really our own. Lawrence thought that we need to be emotionally educated to appreciate our unique, immediate sense experience. And in his novels, he often dealt with the personal consequences for people who had been deprived of such an education. Often, this was the corruption of their personal relationships that they suffered. And in his poetry, he tried to disturb and unsettle the reader, to open her up to the immediacy of her sense experience. So Lawrence adds to the challenge to Frankfurt's notion. The challenge to Frankfurt's notion that what one cares about is the only defensible standard of normative authority in practical matters. Lawrence raises the possibility that what one cares about is due to one's own inadequacies and needs to be corrected. And this is the condition of being able to be emotionally educated. If this is right, then there must be some standard by which one can contrast what one actually cares about with what one should care about. And Lawrence suggested the maxim, which MacIntyre thinks is undeveloped, but it is an important maxim, to resolve to abide by your own deepest prompting. Resolve to abide by your own deepest prompting. For MacIntyre, Lawrence shows what it is to be superficial in one's feelings and responses to others, through his novelistic depictions of such people, for example, and what it is to be open to being emotionally educated. However, he doesn't take us beyond that point. Partly this was due to his personal animosity to psychoanalysis and philosophy. And so what we need to take us beyond Lawrence's point is the writings of Bernard Williams, who was a person who took Lawrence's injunction deeply to heart.